Now, let's start with something that I really enjoy. It's called Mac flooding. And this is where you... No, that's not exactly what a Mac flood is. Great, now you need to go grab something to eat. But a real Mac flood is simply where we have our switch and we go through and we create some Ethernet frames. Each of them will contain a different source MAC address. Now, what happens is we send all those to the switch, which overloads the switch memory and does something to the switch that's kind of peculiar. Actually, it's not peculiar. It's there for kind of redundancy. It dumbs the switch down and basically turns it into a hub. And at that point, I can start sniffing across the switch. And the tools that we can use to perform a Mac flood would include products like Yersinia and MacOff. The next type of pen test that I want to do would be a DHCP starvation attack. Again, we have a DHCP server that has a database of IP addresses that it's issuing out or that has available, kind of the pool of our IPs. Well, what we do is we simply broadcast DHCP requests with spoofed MAC addresses. It eventually exhausts the DHCP server's address space that's in the pool or uses up the pool. Now, if I'm able to accomplish this, my next step would be then to implement a rogue server. So if I've got the company's DHCP server and I've done a DHCP starvation attack, my next thing is I'm going to fire up a virtual machine that has my own version of DHCP server on it to start issuing out IP addresses and maybe to implement other things like a spoofed DNS server, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. The other test that I would want to try to accomplish is seeing if I can do an ARP poison. By trying to compromise the ARP table and changing a MAC address so that the IP address points to another machine can be extremely powerful. And I can use tools like Cain Enable, my personal favorite, and WinARP Attacker. Now, if I'm able to do this, the attacker can also do the same thing and steal information by changing the MAC addresses to their own systems, thus making everybody think that my black box is the destination that they're attempting to go to. Now, since we're talking about Macs and getting hungry, let's talk about a Mac spoof. This is where you buy a Apple computer on the black market and find out that it's counterfeit. No, I'm kidding. We all know that our network cards have MAC addresses associated to them. If I'm able to spoof the MAC address of that network card, the attacker could actually bypass access control lists on routers or even servers because they're pretending to be a different device on the network. One of the most famous tools for this type of an attack that you would use is called SMAC. Okay, another thing that I can try to do is something called an IRDP spoof. IRDP is actually short for ICMP Router Discovery Protocol. It's an extension of ICMP. This particular protocol helps to discover all the routers on the network by listening to the router advertisement messages. So a device that's connected to the network can listen to that protocol, but when they listen, there's a chance there could be a change to the routing table. Now, IRDP doesn't actually use any type of authentication, so attackers can spoof advertising packets and change the data flow route of his choice. So we simply just create a router in our PC and then send IRDP advertisement packets to all the devices that are connected. This changes the routing table of that device that's connected in that subnet. At that point, I can start sniffing data or even implementing man-in-the-middle attacks or even performing a denial of service attack. Now, another test that I want to perform in my pen test is a DNS spoof attack. Now, using tools like ARP spoof or DNS spoof, the attack is designed to misdirect the victim to another address that's under the control of the hacker. So normally someone makes a request for a website, they go to their DNS server. Well, if the attacker is able to listen in and intercept the DNS request of the victim, he can then send a response with the spoofed IP address before the actual response arrives. At this point, the spoofed DNS redirects the victim to my hacked site. But wait, there's more. Yeah, we can also try to do a cache poisoning. Now, in cache poisoning, the target obviously is going to have a browser. And what the attacker, or what I'll attempt to do, is to send a piece of malware that actually goes through and changes the proxy settings of that web browser's interface. And that proxy server is going to be, yep, guess what? Redirecting them to my own personal site. And then finally, I'm going to want to try to do something called a proxy server DNS poisoning. Now, in this type of an attack, the standard network's going to have their DNS server, and users are going to use that DNS server to resolve IP addresses or the DNS names. Well, if I'm able to go through and set up a proxy server and also set a rogue DNS server as the primary DNS server, I can then lure users or the victims into using my proxy server instead of the legitimate server, which would then direct them out to the website of my choice. And of course, after you're done doing all these tests and writing everything down, come on, you guys can finish this sentence for me, right? Documentation, Dale. That's right. You're going to update your documentation, again, showing what vulnerabilities or what attacks you were able to achieve and your recommendations to stopping those types of attacks.